Anu, warm welcome. As
Thank
you
you,
know,
Pat.
this is called Art and the Science of Breathing, and I feel like you're one of the people that like truly goes by the art description of that, but you also bridge towards the science, which I'm looking forward to getting into. Maybe let's start with the fact that you spent 8 months actually wearing two devices that were measuring kind of
Hmm.
different things about the body, especially related to breathing. Could
Right,
you kind of talk about what was going on there and what happened when you noticed them kind
right,
of describing something that you didn't feel inside?
right. So, just to give a bit of a context, my reason to wear these two wearables was largely because I was doing my PhD and I very keenly looking from the technocultural aspects of these technologies. So, also coming from the emerging media studies, so how do these media objects really making meaning to us? And the inquiry began from there. And how do these translations of these meaning making happen? And my research started out also because these two devices had become quite needed for the moment. A bit of a history goes such that I come from a space very different from the US. I'm
Mm.
originally from India, and our lived environments are always outdoorsy. You're never in a controlled environment. But coming to the US, one of the things that I every day woke up to was, what's the weather like? How am I to be prepared? How hot is it going to be? How humid is it going to be? And so I think these devices became a very natural thing to have because you are like constantly with your Apple Watch. And at some point, when there were these glaring realities of the air that we are breathing, it also led me to start looking at another device which would try to help me see, like, are these devices really making sense to me? So I thought, okay, maybe another device would be a good reading. And that's how I started wearing another smart wearable ring. Yeah. And then I decided that this is what my study is going to be. I'm going to invest more and more time to look at what's happening with these two devices on my body. And I went to bed. I lived with it the entire 8 months. And so it was quite interesting. I've had instances where the devices were in conflict with the same body. The physiological being is me, the person who's experiencing me. But the devices who are reading me are telling me two different things, right? I think that was what was the reality. Some of the baselines with which they were operating clearly were different. One would say that, hey, you're very well rested, you've had the sound sleep, and you are like gearing up for the day, while my body was not really telling me that, right? And the ring was telling me another reading altogether. Not very different, but
Mm.
significantly different, to say that, okay, these are like absolutely in friction with how I'm feeling to what it is telling me. So those are the frictions of study that I was looking at.
Yes, yeah, it's a really interesting angle to look at it. And I get, as you already alluded to, you have an MBA, you have this curing degree, and then you have this PhD in arts and technology. I'm
Right.
curious to hear, like, what do you think that combo lets you see that maybe,
Hmm.
you know, other people looking at wearables or engineers,
Hmm.
clinicians perhaps would not?
Right. So let me go back to how this whole journey started, right? I ran a makerspace in a fab lab based out of Bangalore. So what it meant was we were catering to a very diverse set of people as makers. It was a public laboratory, so people were coming to build things. They had great ideas, so they really wanted to realize those ideas. And somebody as me who was facilitating that space, trying to ensure that all the pieces move together for this person to really build the thing. Often the people who come from the technical side come with, very measurable outputs, like, okay, fine, I need to get this done and let me just do it and help me do it. But I think I was somebody who was more interested in the meaning making of it. Like, why would you do this? Of course, they would know who they were making it for, but were they digging deep enough to ask those questions of who, why, what does this really do? Who does it really benefit? And are you making certain assumptions of who these people are who's going to be using this. So I think that criticality is what I was able to bring into the process. And the MBA, certainly, I think for me, when you think about MBA, it gave me the tools to understand that, things circulate in systems in a market. So, which means that there needs to be a business model to it. And at the same time, if you come to think of it, not just business models, right? It's also about what is getting extracted when these technologies come out to the market. So the framing for me became more and more clear through my curatorial studies. One is the business aspects. One is how are you seeing the technical aspects meet the real demands of the cultural need? But now the curatorial aspects of things was however much, whatever is being presented, contextualized and positioned, in relation to other things, how does it shape the meaning as much as of itself? So, what's the story we tell about this part of what it is? So, I think these three were never in conflict with one another. It was more about how were they speaking to one another. And I think PhD in the technology side of things, the arts, humanities, and technology, gave me that language for thinking. And I think that's what makes the possibility of how these human experiences are co-produced. And that's how these two came together, all the 3 or 4 pieces of my life in terms of cultural understanding to what counts, to what makes business ideas worthwhile and investing in came together. So that's how I would say it.
Yeah, so I think it's particularly in the age of AI, like we're all kind of exploring at the same time what it
Yeah.
means to be human. And I think the meaning making aspect of this is like at the tip of everyone's tongue. So I think the having the language, as you mentioned, like or the expertise to understand how to even think about that in a concrete way, that can be really useful. One thing I'm just very personally curious about, because like I think your dissertation was called like the promise and perils of wearables. So I'm curious, like what made you reach out to Alveos early on? I think it was like early this year. Like what was there something different about our approach that made you curious about what we do?
See, I think I had already started my research. I was neck deep in what I was trying to do and looking at these wearables specifically from breath, right? And
Yes.
that is the most important physiological experience that we are all trying to capture through these devices, of course, through the heart rate. And the heart rate will not be read without the breath, right? And they both are absolutely complementing one another. And for me, I was looking at several of the other wearables as well. What does it mean? Some of them are like not necessarily the intense technologies that we're talking with algorithms, but as simple as a blowpipe. But I think your Kickstarter campaign caught my attention also because I came with some bit of skepticism, right? And a skepticism was not about dismissal. It was more to do with paying a very critical, careful attention to what people are saying and what are they telling. And I think clearly in the Alveos story, the Kickstarter, you were approaching it in a very, very different way. You were asking the questions about what happens when you can sense breath continuously. And the kind of humility is very rare, in wearable spaces. Most companies are always trying to promise certain sense of certainty. We know how you're performing. We know your complete recovery status and trust our algorithm attitude. I think you seem to be more genuinely curious about what becomes possible and also about what gets complicated when breath becomes data. So I think that was the thing that caught my attention, that there are no big claims. You're not trying to oversell yourself. And I think you were also trying to say what are the kind of constraints do you navigate? It's also about, because those are the things that as a researcher one is interested in. What values are you trying to protect? And, where do you compromise and why? I think there's a lot more thinking that's happening. And I'm hoping that Alveos, as you're getting into the market, you'll become more and more, the engagement should matter not from, I wouldn't say that I'm an ideological purist.
Yes.
It's great, but when the business has to make sense, I think both have to have equal parts to being sensible and meaningful of what one draws from the other. So
Yeah,
I'm hoping
no,
that Alveos is in that directions. Yeah.
indeed. If we ever get pushed into some direction by the forces
Absolutely.
in our vicinity. I think one thing that I think philosophically speaking is interesting to
Yeah.
note is that there are a lot of technology out there. I think for in this case nervous system, but also in other areas where when you start using the technology, it essentially is trying to kind of make you dependent on it. Where the more you use it, the more dependent you become on the tech. And in the case of, for example, these vagus nerve stimulators, like
Mm-hmm.
if you become to rely on them to feel less stressed, then essentially you're kind of becoming hooked. And it's not like they're not helping; they are probably helping, but
Yeah.
at least for a lot of people, they might be just becoming more and more reliant, and you become less self-reliant without that tech. And I think what's different here is that it's, at least in theory, we're trying
Mm-hmm.
to teach you to become more meta-aware of your own breathing patterns and
Right.
teach you that kind of through biofeedback with this little haptic nudge of like, oh, that's how it feels like when I'm, become aroused when it comes to like physiologically. And then over time, you need that less and less, hopefully. And also you learn the patterns of how you actually steer the ship with your own breathing.
Yeah.
So even if you take out your alveus and put it out, in theory, you should be better prepared and more resilient than without it. But
Absolutely.
anyway, we'll see if that's the case.
I think every new technology also has to start to accept that they're willing to sit with some of the hard questions,
Hmm.
and the hard questions about what they're doing. And I think you seemed willing to operate in that space, not finding it as a deterrent. And that's why I think I reached out to you. Yes.
Hmm. You mentioned breathing, which was kind of the key thesis, and you already alluded to maybe this answer. But I'm curious, like, because you have a lot of different things that these things track, and breathing is like hearts, there's steps, and there's many things. Like, what was it about breathing that made you like focus on that area?
So I think, did I ever mention to you this story of mine where when I came into the US, I think it was the first spring
Hmm.
that actually, see, I think COVID did something to all of us, right? That was the first time that we all became very, very aware of how we are breathing, what air we are breathing, and who are we breathing it with along in the same space. So until then, it was something that we all took it for granted. And
Hmm.
now suddenly there was this, okay, this is my breath. This is the space within which I'm breathing. This is the environment. Now let's maintain this space of mine, which is in the atmosphere, is something that cannot be crossed. And we started putting our own measurement metrics of our breath, right? But
Hmm.
post COVID, while that all happened, also, the environment for me here in the US, because of these constantly being in controlled spaces, the air that I was breathing was always controlled. And I live in a
Hmm.
city like in Dallas, right? The summers are terrible. You can never be out so easy. And the winters are extreme. So, breath is this threshold phenomena, I feel, that is almost instantaneously you can take control, conscious control of, right? There is no other automatic, voluntary phenomena of the bodily processes that you come across that you can take the control much easily as we speak of breath. Your heart beats and you can't control that beat, most certainly not all the time. But breathing is something that you can suddenly pay attention to, consciously pay attention to, and control it. And now, this is one thing where it led me to understand during the time that I had moved to this country and with the severe pollen in the air, right?
Hmm.
I went through this one catastrophic incident. I think it was so bad, the pollens. I was waking up extremely foggy. And there was one such instance, one of those mornings where there was acute numbness in my right hand, my entire right side of the body. And I was rushed to an ER. And only to realize that I was under the impression I was having a stroke. Thankfully, the ER confirmed that it was just the pollens in the air and had more life to live with this question about what's happening to my body.
Yeah.
And That was when I realized that breathing is never just internal. It has both the elements of the externalities and the internalities with which you're constantly negotiating. All right. And I think that is when it became more and more clearer to me that any of these wearables that we are talking about health rely significantly on the heart rate. And for the heart rate to be read, there is this breath factor which needs to be very closely paid attention to. You know, you might go into any sets of theories, but without the breath, the heart that we speak of, and the sleep that we speak of, the movement, the steps, anything that you choose, you could not lose breath out of that conversation. So, this is, and I think that's what did the magic, to make that very conscious decision to study breath through wearables. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what's interesting is, as you very well know, they usually infer breathing from your pulse
Yes.
because you can kind of trace it with understanding how the breathing changes the inhale and your
Yes.
exhale. Your heart becomes faster and slower,
Yes.
but there aren't that many wearables that actually detect directly your breathing rate.
Absolutely.
What about yeah, please go ahead.
No, I was just saying that often most of these devices are only relying on the proxy data of your breath, right? So the direct measurements, as much as a spirometer is the most closest accurate one that one would talk of. And of course, today in consumer wearables, we're also talking about you guys. But
Hmm.
it's always relying on proxy data of other things.
Yes, yes.
So that's where it becomes more and more intriguing and more exciting to read the unknown.
Yeah. What do we look at both sides separately? You have the promise and the perils, and I'd love to delve into both. I think on the promise side, it seems like the main benefit I've seen across the board with Aura, Whoop users, and also others is the idea that through self-reflection, you can
Mhm.
change your behavior on the based on like the data you've been getting like week after week. I think the most typical example is alcohol use, where I think Whoop had this big study where after people who use Whoop, they tend to lower their intake of alcohol because they can see how it destroys their sleep. That's like a decent change in your both your life, but also the actual outcomes that come out of it. Like, what else did you find in terms of like the promise, and also when it comes to meaning making, like that comes from typical wearables?
Right. So I think one of the most important things that I keep talking about, especially with breath and the wearables, is also because it has a long history attached to it, right? Any of these technological devices, what are the promises that it has been made possible? I think the minute we realized that breath, which is so invisible, was now made visible, right? The mechanism, which is very abstract, is now something that, in some bit of a concrete sense, you're able to see, which was not done before, right? And which means that then it made the pathology visible to us. How are we really, if you're wheezing, you're crackling, your
Mm,
breath, it's now telling you that, which otherwise it was a felt understanding of somebody who was trying to explain that, I cannot catch my breath. It is so far and distinct that people cannot even gather what is happening. But the minute you are trying to see through these devices, I'm not only talking about either or of the wearables, I'm also going back to some of these clinical devices, right?
mm,
They allowed that transition to happen. So you're able to see that there is a certain dysfunction or the abnormality that could be now read more closely and understood better. And that's how the mechanism of the body becomes more clearer for one to understand, right? Now, for the longest time, only the doctors through their stethoscope had that authority to say, hey, I hear you, I understand you, and there is a certain sense of a clinical gaze, as one would put it, right? I mean, as you come back through science and technology studies, you trust that device, the doctor, even though you're telling the doctor that, hey, I'm finding heaviness in my heart, The doctor would just keep nodding at you, but the stethoscope is running around your body because he or she is verifying what I'm saying through that stethoscope. So it is being mediated, right? Now, these wearables, the consumer wearables, have given the agency back to the wearer, the user, to see that, hey, how is your body doing? How are you feeling? Are you able to coherently see that what you feel and what you sense is also something that's made visible through some data points from your own vitals?
Mm.
And that is the promise that I think is brilliant. And the wearables have made it extremely the possibility of continuously monitoring oneself.
Yes.
So you're able to see, okay, what's my peak? What's my low? What's my average? So these are the things that has been the promise, I would say, because you're now able to see a certain pattern. At what point, when is it that I'm not feeling comfortable? At what point, so what are my externalities that are influencing my breath now? So I'm able to now better understand where I perform better, where I'm not performing better, and where I might need help and where I need to pay attention to. So these are the promises I certainly see value in. But at the same time, the perils are the places where the dependency is so much that your felt experience of the body to your reading of that data, when they are in conflict, and there are often times that you will see these conflicts, then you're not able to make a judgment call about your feeling to what you're reading, is where the agency is now at question. All right. So that's the perils part that I'm talking about. So, how much do you rely on these devices to tell you how you're feeling? Because the embodied experience, it's your body ultimately, right? So, you should also be, and you need to also understand that they're all working through certain averages of your body type. So, not that you are not getting the data that you have been promised, but it is about how that interpretation is throwing at you that now is informing a certain way of understanding yourself. So that's the perils part that I'm talking about. If one is able to not make a judgment call, one's own bodily experience to one's own reading of that output is where the conflict is. And those are the
Yeah.
perils that I'm more interested in. And as we keep producing more and more technologies and bringing more and more out in the market, people losing their agency to recognize their own bodies is the problem. And that's what I'm alerting everyone to.
Yeah, I think the classic meme where the example is the one where you wake up, you feel great, then you see your sleep score is like 60 out
I
of 100,
know.
and you're like, no, I feel bad now. And then you actually feel worse as if your sleep was worse than
Absolutely.
it was.
Absolutely. And that's where I keep saying that, there was this very interesting article that I read a long time ago. I can't name who that is. The researcher is talking about who is laboring whom. Is the device laboring you or you are laboring the device?
Yes.
So, and it is so obvious if you're always in that state of perplexity and not able to understand, what are you abstracting and what are you taking out? And so that's where the question truly matters.
Mm. I think for myself, speaking for myself at least, now having been wearing the wearables for quite a long time, and of course now also professionally interested in like the space and how other people do it. And what I find is that they're useful for accountability because you feel like somebody's watching. So when it comes to whether it's like fitness goals or whether it's maybe steps or something like that, it's just because somebody's like logging them, they feel more important. But there's of
Mhm.
course the counter side of that, which is like I've seen other people at least, not myself, of course. Then you start like doing things like almost like performative. You're performing
Mhm.
for the wearable, and
Mhm.
then you're trying to satisfy it. Like I get a particular number. You want to have your streak on, and there's like it's difficult because on one hand it feels like, as you mentioned, you're losing agency. But in at least when it comes to steps, you're actually improving your health when you're losing agency and you're trying to get the steps in
Yeah.
to get this, streak.
Yeah.
It's for a stupid reason, but like in the short term, as in the motivation is not the right one, but
Mhm.
actually the benefit is long term is a good one. Like, how do you think about the the trade-off between agency and, in this case, health outcomes?
See, one of the things that I keep saying is, what are these technologies really helping us aid? I think two things that come to my mind at the very top, right? One, to make you become very self aware of your discipline. So, which means that it is helping you discipline your body, right? I mean, you can always counter argue with the panopticon theory of Foucault. Like, you're being always watched, and the sense of surveillance is bringing a certain sense of discipline in you that you're performing now. But let's look at the brighter side of that. In the kind of lifestyles that we live today, habit formation is what we are all trying to struggle with, right? There are good habits that one can form and bad habits one can form. So if you're able to use these technologies, like as everyone says, an atom bomb can be used for a good reason and the wrong reasons as well. It's very simple to that. If you're able to instill the right habits, which is good for you, with your time, your age, your pulse, then if these devices are facilitating that, and the dependency that it is creating, if you're being mindful of that dependency also, like, because now your circadian rhythm has been aligned to your everyday activities, right? It has helped you. It has helped you gain that agency to say that even when this device is not there, this is how my body has been trained. I have made this habit. I have internalized this habit and I live with this habit for the better of myself. Now, whether the device exists or doesn't exist, it has helped you join that path, get to that path, and you are able to make that journey forward for yourself. But if you are not going to trust yourself after that habit formation, that habit itself can turn into many other things, right? Then you start becoming like, okay, the dependency is so much so. And also the way that we start reading the multiple layers of it, which might not be insightful for you. You're just burdening your mind to take unwanted things to, like, draw you out of your own, from your state of mind to become very disturbed. Why would anybody want that, right? So if we are able to draw our lines to the way we use technologies, and these are all the unintended consequences of any technology that will come through us, right? We as human beings are prone to it. So these are all the plausible questions that we will have to throw at ourselves and see, my God, what does it mean? Why do I behave in a way that I do with these devices? So these are all questions that we might have to start asking ourselves at some point.
Yeah, maybe taking a slight step, or not much, but can we talk about sensing prana, right? So you had this, maybe you can describe what it is, and then what was the learning and
Right.
takeaway you had from that?
Right. So why the word prana? Prana comes from a Sanskrit word, and in the yogic practice, we look at prana as not as just the act of inhalation and exhalation. Prana is this vital force of energy that is, traversing through your body. And if you have the ability to control your breath, have a higher chance of prana being the most active proponent moving through all your chakras. So for me, when the question began as a designer, as somebody who's coming from critical media studies aspect, trying to look at what does it mean to look at any of these technologies more closely and the translation of it, I said, I'm going to create a playful interaction and take it to a space which is in an engineering design conference where you usually see the pulse of those conferences are like super busy. People are making poster presentations. They're talking about accurate numbers of their algorithms. They are trying to present and pitch technologies as the ultimate goal of life. So in that kind of a busy engineering conference, I decided to do this exhibition as something that was a moment of pause and reflection, where people walk through this interaction in a very playful sense, but take away the many, many nuances of what I was trying to talk about breath and the measurement of breath. So, Sensing Prana was this exhibition that you would see, which is very inviting. I think it had a very different visual pause in the entire conference where the serenity was at its forefront. So, you walk up to a pinwheel, right? And the natural tendency of the pinwheels is where you blow into it. So, the moment you blow into it, you're trying to see what's happening, where there was an interesting sensor that was placed inside that device through the cast of it. So it would capture your breath. All that it was doing was, based on the pressure sensor, calculate a certain value of your exhaled breath. It was only making note of the CO2 levels. It would throw you in a certain range, and there was this thermal printer attached to it as an output. So there was also the screen. So the moment you are now seeing that, okay, I have given my breath, there's a certain sense of expectation of analysis of my breath, right? So I was like, okay, so what are these people doing? I just wanted to see how they respond to this. So when you blow into it, there was also a visual interface where you would see almost like these molecules scattering up and down and, settling in. These were all just visual cues to play around with the participant. And the thermal printer would print out a breath print. So it is almost like you go to a lab, you've given something for a test, and you are waiting for your values, right? So this is also trying to say that it was very transactional. Your breath is now being transacted, and here is a transactional slip that I'm handing it over to you. And it would just say that, your breath is taking a break. So they would be like, what does it mean? What exactly does it tell? Is it a good breath? Now they're not trusting their own breath, but they're like, okay, does the value change? Can I breathe into it again? Can I blow into this pinwheel again? The sense of uncertainty when you shake them up, it's amazing to see how people respond to their breath prints. So they're like, am I going to do better in my next one? So I had one of the visitors who would go, like, it was a 3-day conference, and all 3 days she would come, blow into the pinwheel, take the receipt, try and compare. So I'm like, hey, what are we talking about? This is exactly what this sense of, the quantified self becomes so much so that you lose a sense of what you're doing. Are you paying attention to what, how
Yeah.
you're interacting with your breath? So this was a very playful, critical, designerly take of asking people to pause about their breath and their measurement of breath and see how they respond to it. And that was what Sensing Prana was all about. Prana is such a complex experience of one who is not identifying that the alignment of both the bodily movement to the breathing to your conscious soul, prana is never going to be at a state that is at its optimal. So this was more about just heightening their senses to understand how we are interacting with these technologies and where we are standing with that. That's what Sensing Prana was all about.
That's
You know,
great. Great
breath is,
story.
yes, and also breath as trace. Breath is a moment that has passed by. It has just gone through. And now you're trying to get this trace out of this breath print, which is like, captured a certain moment in time. And also the ephemerality of the breath print, because all these thermal prints tend to fade with time.
Hmm.
This is the theory of Derrida's trace that I was trying to play with. And that's what Sensing Prana was all about.
Yeah, it's a great story with the lady. I can so imagine like how you like start comparing with your friends, like, oh, who has a better breath and
Yeah, you want to
higher
compare.
force, and it's like, no, that's not what it was about. But and also like as you mentioned, the quantified self, probably when it came about, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, probably even earlier. In the early stage, it was like additive to the existing fully qualitative narrative, right? It was like,
Yeah.
for the first time, we actually start quantifying. We can do experiments. We can see how this affects that. But then it is true that I think in modern day, that movement, or at least a lot of the conversation of narratives around that have become completely like disassociated from the qualitative experience.
Yeah.
in a way that it's not no longer like complementary. It's like almost like if it's not here, it doesn't matter, which is kind
Yes.
of the whole point of your work. Maybe if we take someone who's in that position, who is one of those people who wakes up and they're like feel worse because of their wearable is telling them X and they feel Y, or they just like have trouble already kind of actually with interoception, with understanding their own body, like what would you recommend? I know it's not like this is more like exploratory in nature, your study, but if you have just any advice for someone like that, what would you say as a next step? How do you get back into the agency?
So I think, when let us understand what's the intentionality with which we are sensing these devices, right? I mean, often when we're talking in consumer wearables, it's just every other user who's bought this. For me, it was very, very specific to my research. For an athlete, it is performance based, and that's the reason why they're using this
Yeah.
specific device, right? The use cases are very, very different from one to the other. So if you're going to put them in a band saying that we're all common, we're all the same body types, that's not going to work either. So for anybody who is always in conflict with it, I would say that, dig deep, a little more inquiry to look at whether the ways that you're reading the data sets, are, what do you say, are in correlation with the other data sets that are also coming your way. Because most often, you do not rely on one particular device. You always want to see with the benchmarks of the other tests as well. Because often, when you are going for your blood work, blood vision, you're doing your other things, you want to see one collective document or one collective reading of how are these making sense. Is this really what I'm feeling, or is there some bit of an ambiguity in reading this? Get the help that you need. And I think most of these devices do not have the support system, clinical support systems that one should really provide support to. Everything has become a subscription model, so which means that the access through those subscription models becomes very limiting and it's cost prohibitive for a consumer use. So even if there are FAQ pages that are made accessible more and more in terms of the clinical assessment, because nobody wants to take charge of that, right? This should not be read as the final directive from this device. But if we are able to address more and more open forums for people who are self researchers, self inquirers, it becomes more educative of that particular device, and also for that person to feel the needed trust to gain one's own agency and also work with the device. I think that's the piece that often gets missed. There is no moderated forums where people can trust whoever is saying in Reddit that he or she is a credible source to read that
Mhm.
data in a certain way. So if there is scope for companies themselves to create those platforms for conversations, make it more participative, then it becomes more easy. Like, they have so many chatbots that people create only to sell the device, but not to assist the reading and the meaning making of that output. If there is scope for that, then it becomes like, hey, we are all participants of it. I am sharing something and I'm also getting a response feedback, and there is a group who is able to assist me and support me and think through this, not just for myself. And maybe these conversations become the core material for the next upgrade of that device. So
Mm.
if there are more support systems that create, rather than just selling the technology in numbers, but helping make meaning with those technologies, because they both inform one another, right?
Yes.
So
How do you
that
think?
will make a value add, I think.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to like making meaning of data specifically, and like in terms of what does this like, how might you want to change your behavior based on what we see in the data? It seems like a lot of providers, including ourselves, are turning heavily into AI,
Hmm.
which is quite good at pattern recognition. How do you think that will change this kind of what you were seeing? Because imagine that you have as a primary interface instead of seeing numbers, you actually have an AI coach. And it
Mm-hmm.
either surfaces something on its own or you
Mm-hmm.
ask it questions based on your own observations. How do you think this will change in the coming, let's say, couple of years?
See, I think AI is also something that is human made, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
It's an algorithm ultimately. You are now, if you're able to train the model in a very skilled, responsive way, rather than to hold on to the tensions that somebody's expressing of their bodily narrative, if the trained algorithm is given the humanity and the humaneness of the experience that we're talking, I think today's models are so well trained and have so much more to be calibrated with, and that is the direction we are going to go. There is no escaping that at all, Patrick. It's all about learning to work with the algorithm much more. So how do you build the trust feature in the algorithm?
Hmm.
How are we really, I mean, if we're really talking about the numbers that we want to meet, the kind of, the vast expansive population that we really want to touch through these mediated technologies, I think the training of these models have to be very diverse in nature. It cannot be, the baselines cannot be with atypical body types, right? And I think we've had these conversations, whose body, the European male, cisgender, blah, 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 blah. But if you're able to bring in the model sets with the diversity that I'm talking about, be it from neurodivergent to any other extremities that we are talking about, if that's a possibility, and also say that the technologies also have to kind of declare that this is the limitations and the scope of this, but not as a disclaimer fine print thing, but making it more and more outright visible to people that this is the match, this is the information, and this is how this device agreements are at, and the disagreements can start. So if you're able to let your audience and your technology sit with the disagreements that are already there and allow both sides of the spectrum, even the algorithm and for the human being, to think about what it means with that disagreement, I think you've already built in a sound model. So rather than saying that this is one way or the highway, that's not going to work. And that's why I keep saying that the responses of any of these data sets, if you're talking about a therapist, is looking at something very different to a clinician who's looking at it very different, to an athlete looking at it very different, right? So I think AI is the way forward. Nobody's going to let go of it. I'm sure as we as human beings can train the model better and also
Hmm.
have both the human and the AI work together in this space. That's what I would say.
No, it's well said. And I think as you kind of alluded to, it allowed us for two-way conversation
Yeah.
because then you can actually say, well, actually, I feel like this, and then it allows us to learn.
Yeah.
And the kind of feedback loop is critical in
And
improving the
if there
models.
is a possibility for constant documentation to make it public, it's not about just the algorithm is working and keeping at
Hmm.
it only for your research aspect, but make it more public, make it more evidently out there so that the participation from the public can be more and more. Then I think collectively you're able to grow the embodied experience of the person owning the device and the device also coming to be in the market for the right reasons.
Indeed. Oh no, it's been a huge pleasure. Is there anything that you feel like we haven't covered, but it would be worthwhile to still cover as we start drawing to a close?
I think we've done quite a bit. We've had
Indeed.
an interesting conversation about all of this. Yeah, I'm good. I'm good unless you feel there's anything else that's
If
missing.
if people want to learn more about the work you've done, or maybe you want to actually reach out to work on something adjacent to what we talked about, where can they find you and more about what you do?
So, first and foremost, I would really encourage people to read my thesis, my dissertation, which is there. I'm sure you're sharing that link. It's
Yes,
called out as Exhaling Data, Promise and Perils of Wearable Technologies. You should be able to find it on ProQuest. It's out there through Google Scholar. You should be able to find it. Otherwise, I have my website. It's anupamagowda.com, and you should be able to reach me very easily. That's it. So
brilliant.
I look forward to more engaging conversations and more work together. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you, Anu. And to everyone listening, you'll find all the links we just discussed in the show notes. Otherwise, have a lovely and also hopefully agentic, week forward so you can still control. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.